Okay guys, so I thought I would make a video here because I know cellular respiration and photosynthesis are two of probably the more difficult topics that we'll go over in biology, and this is a video to give you an overview of some of the important stuff that you'll need to know about it, and this way you can rewatch this a couple times if you're getting confused on certain steps or how the process works. So remember, right here, this picture here in the upper left corner is an overview of all of cellular respiration in cells or in the body. Remember, we always start with glucose. So no matter if you eat or if your body is trying to use fats, carbohydrates, or proteins, I'm going to use a smaller pen, or proteins, they all get turned into glucose by your body, and you don't need to know how that works, just know that it happens, and then they're all turned into glucose before any of this starts. So then we have glucose. The first step is glycolysis. So glycolysis is represented by this picture here. Glycolysis. So there's glycolysis, right? We start with glucose, and you don't need to know all the steps. There's lots of different steps in all of these that luckily you don't need to know. But you do need to know kind of what we start with in these processes and what we end with. So with glucose, we start, the reactants are on the top here, right? We need 2 ATP, we need 2 NAD molecules, and then we need 4 ADP molecules. Now remember, ADP is like the low energy form of ATP, right? We should know by now that ATP is the energy, the form of energy that all cells use for pretty much everything. They use ATP. And after ATP is used, it turns back into ADP. So ADP is just like the low energy form, and then it gains energy, it becomes ATP, and then the cells can use that energy. So notice in glycolysis, we need 2 ATP, and we use 2 of those, and they turn into ADP. We start with NAD, we end with NADH. Remember, NADH are the electron carriers that we use later in the electron transport chain. And then we need 4 ADP, and we get 4 ATP. So we have a net gain. It's important to know a net gain of 2 ATP, right? We had 2, but we used 2, and then we made 4. So 4 minus 2 would be 2 ATP. So we say a net gain of 2 ATP, and then we have 2 NADH molecules, and then we end here. Remember, this is important for the next step in the process. We end with 2 pyruvate. 2 pyruvate molecules. Remember, they're also called pyruvic acid, so if you see pyruvate or pyruvic acid, that means the same thing. And then we could also say, if we want to be technically correct, we'd say we end with 2 ADP molecules also, but we kind of take care of that with our net gain of 2 ATP. Okay, so glycolysis, yes, we made some ATP. In fact, we made 2 ATP here. The next step, we can see we either go across to the Krebs cycle or we go down to fermentation. Remember, fermentation is anaerobic respiration, meaning without oxygen. So fermentation is if we don't have any oxygen, or our body does not have enough oxygen, then we go down here into this fermentation, and I'll talk about that in a separate video. We're going to focus on going this way in this video, aerobic respiration. And remember, aerobic respiration means with oxygen. So we have aerobic respiration is this way with oxygen. Anaerobic is this way without oxygen, because the prefix "an" here means without. So anaerobic without oxygen, aerobic with oxygen. So we just finished glycolysis here, and now we see we move on to, if we have oxygen, we're going to the Krebs cycle. So the Krebs cycle is right here. The Krebs cycle. Remember, it's also commonly called the citric acid cycle. So citric acid cycle, Krebs cycle, those are both the same. Important things to note here, again, are what we start with on the left side, what we end with on the right side, and then also the starting molecule for the Krebs cycle. So we had pyruvate, two pyruvates, and there's a chemical chain, there's a chemical reaction, and we end up getting acetylous molecule called acetyl-CoA. So for each pyruvate molecule here, we get one acetyl-CoA molecule. And again, you don't need to know the chemical reactions and how that happens. Just know pyruvate gets changed into a molecule called acetyl-CoA. And then one for each pyruvate. So we'd actually have two acetyl-CoAs. We start in the Krebs cycle with 3 NAD+, 1 FAD, 3 waters, and then 1 ADP, and plus PI means the phosphate. So ADP, there's 2 phosphate molecules, diphosphate. ATP is triphosphate, so we have to add a phosphate on to make it ATP. And then notice we get out, again, just like in glycolysis, ADP turns into, or excuse me, NAD turns into NADH. So here's our 3 NAD. We get out 3 NADH. We have 1 FAD. This is a new thing we haven't seen yet. We get out 1 FADH2. And remember, these two are both electron carriers. So they're going to carry some extra electrons, and then in the electron transport chain over here, they're going to donate those electrons to help create more ATP. So for now, they're just carrying extra electrons, carrying high energy electrons. And then we need water, so this is part of the reasons why we need to drink so much water. We use it a lot in the Krebs cycle. And then we get out, this is why we breathe out CO2, carbon dioxide, from our mouths, is because that's a waste product in the Krebs cycle. And then we need 1 ADP, and we get out a single ATP, so not that much, really, right? And then the overall reaction, if you like to look at it this way instead of in the picture, whichever one you prefer, these are the same thing. Start with acetyl-CoA, 3 NAD, 1 FAD, 1 ADP, and phosphate, 3 waters, and we get out 2 carbon dioxides, 3 NADH, 3 hydrogen ions, and those aren't shown here, but you don't focus on what's in this picture. 1 FADH, 2 an ATP, and then this is just part of the extra molecule, so don't worry about that one. Okay, so now we're done with the Krebs cycle. We're going on to the electron transport chain, and that's right here, also called the ETC, the electron transport chain. And this is where we make the majority of the ATP. Now we use, notice we start over here, we use that NADH and the FADH2 in order to pump the protons across the membrane here. So we start here, notice NADH releases the H, and some electrons go into this protein here, and they get transported, and those electrons are holding energy, they're carrying energy, and so some of that energy in the electrons is used to pump protons across the membrane here, right? So four protons are pumped for every NADH molecule. And then here's FADH2, and so some more electrons get on here. The electrons are moved through this whole complex. We pump more protons, more H+ ions across the membrane, and the electrons go in here. We have some more protons pumped across, and you don't need to know all the names of these or what exactly is happening, but you do need to know that these electrons that are carried by NADH and FADH2, they're those high energy electrons. We're using the energy in those electrons to push protons across this membrane and make so there's lots and lots of protons here. There's a very high concentration of protons here and a very low concentration of protons on this side of the membrane. And because we know that molecules they really want to go from high concentration to low concentration, there's a lot of potential energy stored in that. These protons really want to go to this other side of the membrane where there's a low concentration. And so there's one protein, this one right here, called ATP synthase, that allows these protons to go down their concentration gradient, to go from high concentration to low concentration. And this protein uses the energy, it uses the movement of those protons to turn ADP into ATP. Okay, so the movement of the protons from high concentration on this side of the membrane to low concentration on this side of the membrane is harnessed by this protein here, and it uses that energy, the energy of the movement of the protons, to create ATP. So it starts with ADP and an extra phosphate, and then using that energy it creates ATP. Okay. And then notice here, this is where also in the electron transport chain where we use oxygen. So we need oxygen to keep the electron transport chain going. It's what these extra electrons, you can see they're coming out here, and oxygen will take those extra electrons and it will make water. So electrons, and then we get water. And right here, we have the overall, if we're looking here, we have the overall equation for cellular respiration. So what do we get out of all this stuff? We start with the glucose, right? We know that. Started with the glucose way back up here in the beginning, starting with glucose. And oxygen. We breathe in the oxygen. Right, and we used that right here in the electron transport chain. And then we breathe out, yep, carbon dioxide. That was a waste product right here in the Krebs cycle. And then water, we created water here in the electron transport chain. And then of course we needed 36 ADP, and we get 36 ATP. And this is for 1 molecule of glucose. So for every 1 molecule of glucose, we get 36 ATP. For 1 molecule of glucose. And we can count that, right? We can count, so, well, how do we get 36 ATP? Let's see, glycolysis right here, remember we had a net gain of 2 ATP. Here, for every 1 molecule of acetyl-CoA, we had 1 ATP. And remember, glucose gets split in half, so we got 2 pyruvates, which meant we had 2 acetyl-CoA molecules. So we used 2 of them, so really, for every 1 molecule of glucose, we'd have 2 ATP. So we could put 1 molecule of glucose equals 2 ATP. So there's 2 ATP, 2 ATP, there's 4 ATP. And then the electron transport chain, for every molecule of glucose, we end up getting 32 ATP. And you don't need to know exactly how that all works out and how many electrons equal 1 ATP or anything. Just know the electron transport chain, for every 1 molecule of glucose, we get 32 ATP. So it comes up to 36 overall. And another very important thing to know for your test coming up on this unit is comparing and looking at the equations for photosynthesis and cellular respiration. And we'll go over photosynthesis tomorrow in our Class Connect session, and we'll learn how that works. But you can see here, and this image shows it pretty clearly, the waste products of one are the reactants of the other. So notice the products here of photosynthesis, sugar and oxygen, look at, they're the reactants for cellular respiration, right? We need glucose and we need oxygen. Here it is right here, glucose and oxygen. And then the waste products, carbon dioxide and water, for cellular respiration, which we just talked about, right? Carbon dioxide and water. Oh, they go right back up here. Look what plants need for photosynthesis, carbon dioxide and water. So it's very cyclical. It's very cyclical. We need plants and plants need us. Photosynthesis and respiration are opposite reactions basically. And one that can't continue to function without the other. Okay, I hope that helped clear things up, and I'll see you guys in class tomorrow.